All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at a theological mystery from way back in the ninth century.
Ninth century, wow. That's going way back.
It is. So we'll be focusing on this book called On the Body and Blood of the Lord.
Catchy title.
Oh yeah, a real page-turner. But seriously, this book was written by a monk named Ratramnus, and get this. It was written at the request of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles the Bald.
Wow, so this was a pretty high-stakes assignment. Talk about pressure.
You can say that again. But here's the kicker. This book, written for the emperor himself, was later condemned as heretical and, you guessed it, burned.
Ouch. That's gotta hurt.
Mm.
But you said it was a mystery, so what's the mystery here?
Well, the mystery is that today, some scholars consider this very same book to be completely orthodox.
So how can one book be viewed so differently across time? Like, what changed?
That's precisely what we're going to be looking at today. So to unravel this mystery, we're going to be drawing on a couple of sources. First, we've got excerpts from Ratramnus's book itself.
Always good to go straight to the source.
Right. And second, we have this really interesting dissertation. It's from 1689, and it's by a theologian named James Boileau, who, fun fact, was a huge defender of Ratramnus.
So, setting the record straight a few centuries later.
Exactly. Okay, so before we jump into the content of the book and all the juicy theological debates, we need to address the elephant in the room who actually wrote this thing.
Yeah, because if it caused this much controversy, I'm sure there are a few people who'd rather not have their name attached to it.
Well, you're not wrong. There's actually some debate about the authorship of On the Body and Blood of the Lord. In fact, a Jesuit priest by the name of John Hardouin, he was a bit of a firebrand himself, claimed that this book wasn't penned by Ratramnus at all, but by another big name from that era, John Scotus Erigena.
That's interesting. So we have a potential case of mistaken identity on our hands.
Possibly. So the question is, how do we know who to believe?
Yeah, good question. How can we be sure if it was Ratramnus or Erigena?
Well, that's where our friend Boileau comes in. Remember that 1689 dissertation I mentioned? He goes to great lengths to debunk Hardouin's theory.
Okay, so Team Ratramnus has a champion. What evidence does Boileau bring to the table?
Some pretty compelling stuff. He points to these ancient manuscripts we're talking, like 800 years old. These manuscripts clearly name Ratramnus as the author.
Wow, that's hard to argue with. 800 years old? They must have been handling those things with gloves.
Oh, I'm sure. And here's another point in Ratramnus's favor. Those ancient manuscripts actually predate Erigena. So, chronologically speaking, it just doesn't add up for Erigena to be the author.
Uh-huh. So timeline shenanigans. Looks like Hardouin might have gotten his dates mixed up.
Yeah, it seems that way. But there's more. Boileau dives into the content of the book and points out that Erigena held some pretty radical views on, well, how should I put this, Christ's resurrected body. And those views clash big time with what's actually written in On the Body and Blood of the Lord.
So not only does the timeline not fit, but the ideas don't match up either. Case closed, right?
You'd think so, but of course it wouldn't be a good theological mystery without some added wrinkles. Just to make things extra confusing, there was another theologian kicking around at the same time named Bertram.
Oh boy, another name. This is getting tricky to keep track of.
I know, right? And as you can imagine, Bertram and Ratramnus, their names get mixed up sometimes.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen.
Yeah.
Similar names, similar time period must have been confusing even back then.
Absolutely. And if that wasn't enough, centuries later, a group called the Berengarians got a hold of Ratramnus's book and used it to support their, let's just say, unique interpretation of the Eucharist.
Oh, so now we've got a case of mistaken identity and some theological borrowing gone wrong. This is like a medieval soap opera. So let me get this straight. We've got solid evidence pointing to Ratramnus as the author, but thanks to some similar names and some later interpretations, things have gotten a bit muddled.
Exactly. But even if we settle on Ratramnus as the author, and I think it's safe to say we can, there's still this looming question. Was he a heretic, as some claimed? I mean, his book was condemned, and burning books was not exactly a light punishment back then.
No kidding. So what was it about Ratramnus's ideas that rubbed people the wrong way? What made them label him a heretic?
Well, to understand that, we need to take a quick detour into some key terms. First up, transubstantiation.
Transubstantiation. That's a mouthful. Okay, so transubstantiation is...
It's the official Catholic doctrine that states during the Eucharist, the bread and wine actually become the body and blood of Christ.
Okay, so the bread and wine transform into Christ,
L-
literally.
Literally. But back in Ratramnus' time, there were differing opinions on how to interpret the Eucharist, and the emperor, Charles the Bald, he was hoping Ratramnus could help clear things up. So he asks Ratramnus to write this book on the body and blood of the Lord to address these different interpretations swirling around.
So, did he succeed? Did Ratramnus manage to settle the debate?
Well, that depends on who you ask. Some folks weren't too happy with what Ratramnus had to say. They criticized him, claiming that he was putting forward his personal beliefs instead of upholding the official doctrine of the church. And back then, that was a pretty bold move.
I can imagine. The Eucharist is kind of a big deal in Christianity. So, what exactly did Ratramnus say that caused such a stir?
Well, for starters, he didn't buy into this whole literal interpretation thing. He wasn't convinced that everything in the Eucharist had to be taken completely literally. Instead, he drew a distinction between figure and truth.
Okay, so figure versus truth. What did he mean by that?
He was basically arguing that the bread and wine are symbols. They're a figure of Christ's body and blood, but they don't literally become him. They point to a deeper truth.
I see. So, kind of like how a national flag represents a country but isn't actually the country itself. It's a symbol that points to something bigger.
That's a great analogy. And of course, not everyone was thrilled with this symbolic interpretation.
Yeah, I can see how that would ruffle some feathers, especially back then. So, where does Boileau stand on all of this? He was a big fan of Ratramnus, right?
He was, and in his dissertation, he goes to bat for Ratramnus, arguing that he was actually following in the footsteps of the early church fathers. Boileau claims that many of Ratramnus's ideas actually align with traditional Catholic teachings.
So, maybe not a heretic after all, just a bit ahead of his time, maybe a bit too symbolic for some tastes.
Perhaps. It's important to note that Ratramnus did believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He just believed it was a spiritual presence, veiled under the appearance of bread and wine, not a physical transformation.
Okay, now that's a subtle difference. So Ratramnus was basically arguing for a different way of understanding the Eucharist. He wasn't denying Christ's presence, he just wasn't on board with the literal interpretation of bread and wine becoming flesh and blood.
Exactly. It's like he was pushing back against a purely materialistic understanding of the Eucharist and saying, hey, faith plays a huge role here. And interestingly, this aligns with what a lot of prominent theologians throughout history have taught, even some who were initially met with resistance.
Oh, really? Like who?
We'll take the ancient Latin Mass, for example,
Oh.
or the works of Origen and Claudius Spence. All of these were initially criticized and even condemned, but later found acceptance within the church.
So maybe Ratramnus just got caught in the crossfire of a theological debate that was still evolving. It seems like history is full of examples where an idea is initially rejected but later becomes part of the accepted tradition.
Absolutely. But if Ratramnus wasn't advocating for a completely symbolic Eucharist, how did he actually explain this complex mystery? What were his key ideas?
Well, to really grasp his perspective, we have to unpack some key terms he uses. Figure, which we've already touched on, truth, conversion, transposition, sacrament, and mystery.
He certainly wasn't afraid of diving deep.
Not at all. So we know he believed the bread and wine were figures of Christ's body and blood, but what did he mean by truth?
Yeah, what was he getting at with that? Truth, what did that mean to him?
Well, in the context of the Eucharist, truth pointed to the spiritual reality of Christ's presence, something you access through faith. He actually wrote, "A figure is like a shadow showing something through certain coverings. But truth," he says, "truth is the clear demonstration of something, not hidden by any images of darkness."
Oh, I like that. So the emphasis is not on the physical elements themselves, but on the inner experience of encountering Christ through faith.
Exactly. And it's really interesting because he even compares the Eucharist to other sacraments and symbols in the Bible, like the manna in the desert, the water of baptism, and even the blood of Christ shed on the cross.
So he's weaving together all these sacred signs, these symbols, showing how they all point to a deeper spiritual reality. Pretty insightful.
He was. And to further clarify his viewpoint, he used terms like conversion and transposition.
Okay, let's unpack those. Conversion first. What did he mean by that?
For Ratramnus, conversion didn't mean a physical change in the bread and wine. It suggested an internal, spiritual change within the believer.
Gotcha. So the focus shifts from the elements themselves to how they're perceived and experienced through faith.
Right. It's about what's happening within the believer, not just what's happening on the altar. And then you've got transposition, which for him implies a shift in meaning or understanding, going from the literal to the symbolic. He argued the bread and wine don't stop being bread and wine. They just take on a new meaning, a deeper significance when they are consecrated as the Eucharist.
So they become something more than just ordinary bread and wine, not through a physical transformation, but through the act of consecration and the faith of the believer.
You got it.
Yeah.
And this leads us to another important term, sacrament.
Okay, let's break that one down. What did Ratramnus mean by sacrament? What was his take on that?
Well, for him, a sacrament was a visible sign of an invisible grace, a tangible way for God to communicate his presence and power. And the way he saw it, the Eucharist was the ultimate sacrament. It was the most profound expression of God's grace, made visible through those simple elements of bread and wine.
So he's taking something as ordinary as bread and wine and elevating it to represent this profound spiritual encounter with God's grace. Very interesting.
It is, isn't it? And he wasn't just content with explaining the mechanics of the Eucharist. He wanted to connect it to this grand story of God's relationship with humanity. And he did that by comparing the Eucharist to those biblical symbols we talked about earlier, like the manna in the desert or the blood of the Passover lamb.
I see. So he's highlighting how God uses physical things to communicate spiritual realities, to reveal his presence in ways we can understand, even when the full reality behind those signs remains a mystery.
Exactly. And that brings us to the last term, mystery. Ratramnus didn't see mystery as a problem to be solved, but rather something to embrace.
So it's not about having all the answers figured out, but about trusting in something bigger than ourselves, even when we don't fully understand it.
You nailed it. He was saying, let go of that need to control and define everything and just trust in the mystery.
Wow, that's powerful. And I think that resonates with a lot of people, even those who might not consider themselves particularly religious. We all have those things in life that we just accept on faith, things we can't fully explain, but that give us a sense of meaning and purpose.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why Ratramnus's ideas continue to fascinate us, even after all these centuries. He speaks to that deep human need for something that goes beyond our everyday experience, something that connects us to a larger reality.
It's that longing for the transcendent, for something that takes us beyond the limits of our understanding.
Precisely.
Well, we've certainly uncovered a lot about Ratramnus and his unique perspective on the Eucharist, but the story doesn't end there. In our next segment, we're going to dive into some of the specific criticisms that were leveled against him and see how he defended his ideas.
Stay tuned. It's going to get even more interesting. All right, so we're back, and we're delving deeper into Ratramnus's understanding of the Eucharist. As we discussed, his views were pretty nuanced, quite different from that literal interpretation of transubstantiation.
Right. And as you might expect, not everyone was exactly thrilled with his take on things.
Yeah, not exactly a universally popular opinion.
So let's dig into those criticisms. What were the main points of contention? What were people so upset about?
Well, one of the biggest issues people had was that they felt Ratramnus was basically presenting his own personal opinions rather than sticking to the official teachings of the church. And back then, this was a pretty risky move, especially when it came to something as central as the Eucharist.
Yeah, I can see how that could be perceived as challenging the church's authority. It's a bold move, for sure.
Wow.
Did Ratramnus ever address those criticisms directly? Did he respond to those accusations?
Oh, he did. Ratramnus argued that he wasn't trying to undermine the church or anything like that. He said his goal was to encourage a deeper understanding of the Eucharist by exploring different interpretations. And remember, this was a time of serious theological debate. Even the definition of transubstantiation, it was still being hammered out.
So, more of a lively academic discussion than an outright rebellion against the church.
That's a good way to put it. He believed that open dialogue was important for a richer understanding of faith, which honestly makes a lot of sense. But of course, not everyone saw it that way.
Of course not. There are always those who prefer things to stay as they are. So, what other criticisms did he face?
Well, another major point of contention was that whole distinction he made between figure and truth when talking about the Eucharist.
Right, that was a key part of his argument. He said the bread and wine symbolize Christ's presence, but don't literally become his flesh and blood. That seemed to be at the core of the controversy.
It was. Because it was a pretty significant departure from that increasingly popular view of transubstantiation, that idea that the substance of the bread and wine completely transforms into Christ's body and blood during consecration.
Right. And it all comes down to how literally you interpret religious language. I mean, for some people, the words describing the Eucharist have to be taken completely literally. But for others, like Ratramnus, the focus was on the symbolic meaning and that spiritual experience.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Ratramnus recognized that symbolism had a power to convey these deep spiritual truths. And he was really pushing back against this purely material interpretation, emphasizing that faith plays a big role in how you experience Christ's presence.
So he wasn't denying Christ's presence in the Eucharist, just questioning how that presence manifests, right?
Exactly. For him, it was about the transformation that happens within the believer through faith, not just the elements themselves changing. And that's where his concept of conversion, that interchange, comes in.
Ah, I see. So for Ratramnus, the true power of the Eucharist lies in its ability to transform us spiritually. It's about strengthening that connection with Christ, not about watching some magical transformation of bread and wine.
Perfectly put. And this emphasis on the spiritual experience connects to his use of the word mystery, too. Remember how he believed that there was something sacred about not fully grasping the Eucharist? Well, he argued that it's actually through faith that we tap into its true power, its real meaning.
That's a beautiful idea. It's like he's saying the more we try to pin it down to define something as sacred as the Eucharist, the further we move away from its essence. It's about surrendering to that mystery, embracing the unknown.
You got it. And that's what makes his interpretation so compelling, so thought-provoking. It speaks to that deep human need for something that goes beyond what we experience every day, something beyond logic and reason.
Yeah, that longing for something bigger than ourselves, something transcendent.
Precisely. And that brings us back to another key term Ratramnus used, sacrament.
Oh, right, right. So remind me, how did he define that?
Well, he defined it as a visible sign of invisible grace. So basically, the physical elements of the bread and wine, they become a channel for this deeper spiritual reality.
Okay, so it's about that connection between the physical and the spiritual. Those elements, they take on a deeper meaning, a deeper purpose.
Exactly. And he saw the Eucharist as the ultimate sacrament, like the most powerful expression of God's grace made visible through those everyday things, bread and wine.
It's pretty incredible how he took something as ordinary as bread and wine and gave them such profound spiritual significance. He saw this deep connection between these simple elements and this profound encounter with God's grace.
It is pretty amazing. And he didn't stop there. He drew all these parallels with other biblical symbols too, like that manna in the desert, the blood of the Passover lamb. He really wanted to emphasize how God uses these physical things, these tangible things, to communicate with us, to show us his presence, his grace, in ways that we can actually grasp.
Right, even if that ultimate reality behind those signs is still a mystery, still something that we can't fully comprehend.
Exactly. And now, that brings us back to those criticisms that were leveled against Ratramnus.
Okay, back to the critics. What did they have to say about all this?
Well, some people were worried that by focusing so much on that symbolic meaning, he was kind of downplaying the importance of the physical elements.
I see. So they were concerned that he was tipping the scales too far toward the symbolic and not giving enough weight to the literal transformation that they believed was central to the Eucharist.
You got it. They were afraid that people would start to doubt the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist if they focused too much on the symbolic aspect. They felt that he was taking away from the miraculous nature of that sacrament, that incredible transformation of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. For them, that physical change, that was where the true power resided, not just in the spiritual experience of the believer.
So essentially, it was a clash between two very different ways of understanding this fundamental mystery.
Exactly. One view emphasized that literal physical transformation, while the other, Ratramnus's view, emphasized that symbolic meaning and the spiritual transformation that happens within the believer. Two very different ways of approaching the same mystery.
And this tension, it's something that runs through a lot of religious history, isn't it? This back and forth between the material and the spiritual, what we can see and what we can't.
Oh, absolutely. It's a tension that we still wrestle with today, even outside of religious contexts. It's that age-old question.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile the things that we can see and touch with the things that we can only experience through faith, through intuition? It's a question that's captivated philosophers and scientists and theologians for centuries.
And it's a question that Ratramnus's work forces us to grapple with in a whole new light. He's urging us to look beyond the surface, to lean into that mystery, to trust in that power of faith, to lead us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
It's a powerful message, for sure. And it reminds us that there's often more to things than meets the eye.
Okay, so we've talked about this clash between the literal and the symbolic interpretations of the Eucharist. But Ratramnus also faced another major criticism, right? He was accused of undermining the church's authority.
Ah, yes, the classic struggle between individual interpretation and institutional authority. That's a theme that pops up everywhere, not just in religion, but in politics, in art, in science. It's a constant balancing act, that negotiation between personal understanding and the norms of the group, the tradition.
So, how did Ratramnus handle that delicate situation? Did he address that accusation of undermining the church's authority?
He did. He argued that he wasn't trying to challenge the church's authority. He saw himself as participating in this ongoing theological discussion within the church, contributing to that conversation. He believed that honest and open debate, that was crucial for achieving a deeper understanding of faith.
So, he saw himself as part of that larger conversation, not as some lone wolf trying to tear down the established order.
Exactly. He wasn't trying to overthrow the system. And it's important to remember the historical context here. This was a time when the church was still consolidating its power, defining those doctrines, that idea of a single, unified church with a super strict set of beliefs, that was still taking shape.
Right, there was more room for different interpretations back then. He wasn't necessarily going against the grain, he was helping to shape that grain.
Yeah, great way to put it. And remember, he was engaging in this debate that was happening at the highest levels of the church. We're talking emperors, bishops, leading thinkers. It wasn't just some fringe movement happening in the shadows.
So, what was it that caused such a stir? What did Ratramnus actually say that people perceived as this threat to the church's authority?
Well, one thing that raised eyebrows was that he was willing to present his personal understanding of the Eucharist, even acknowledging that it might differ from the official teachings. He didn't shy away from putting his own interpretation out there.
That seems like a pretty straightforward approach to me. He was being transparent about his perspective.
Right. It seems that way to us now. But back then, that focus on individual understanding, that could be seen as a challenge to the church's authority, which was, still solidifying at that point.
It's fascinating how what's considered acceptable, how much freedom of thought you have, how that changes so much over time. What might seem like a normal academic debate in one era could be seen as a serious threat in another.
Absolutely. And that just shows how crucial context is when we try to understand historical events. We can't look at the past through modern eyes. We have to try to understand the social and political dynamics of the time. What people were worried about, what they were hoping for.
It's a reminder that history is never a simple story. It's always multifaceted, full of different viewpoints.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And in the case of Ratramnus, that willingness to put his own views out there, even when they went against the grain, it speaks volumes about his courage. He wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo in his pursuit of truth.
That's a quality that we really need if we want to make progress, not just in religion, but in any field. It's about asking those tough questions, pushing the boundaries of what we think we know.
For sure. And that often comes at a price. People who challenge the way we think, they often face pushback, even persecution. History is full of examples.
Ratramnus' story certainly reminds us of that. But even though his ideas sparked all this controversy, they continued to resonate and influence people throughout history.
You're right. It's like his ideas took on a life of their own. They might have been condemned or suppressed, but they found ways to resurface, to reach new audiences.
It's like those ideas, they have a spirit, an energy that just can't be contained, can't be snuffed out.
Exactly. They find a way. And in Ratramnus' case, those ideas are still with us, still challenging us to some deeply about the nature of faith, about the role of ritual, about those big enduring mysteries at the heart of being human.
Mysteries that continue to fascinate and perplex us.
Exactly. We might not have all the answers, but that doesn't mean we stop asking the questions. Right?
Definitely not. The journey of exploration, that's part of the beauty of faith.
For sure. And speaking of exploring, we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still more to uncover. In our next segment, we're going to dive into some specific passages from Ratramnus' book, looking at the language he used, the arguments he made to support his controversial interpretation of the Eucharist.
Sounds good. We're going to get up close and personal with his words. And we're back. Welcome back to our deep dive on Ratramnus and the Eucharist. It's been a fascinating journey so far, exploring his ideas, the pushback they received, and the whole controversy surrounding them.
It has. It's amazing how one monk writing all those centuries ago could spark such a long-lasting debate about this central Christian ritual.
Exactly. And in this final segment, I want to shift gears a bit and focus on the lasting impact of Ratramnus's work. We've touched upon it here and there, but I think it's worth taking a closer look at how his ideas have continued to echo through the centuries.
Yeah, it's really incredible to think about how a theological debate from the 9th century can still have ripples today.
So, where do we see these ripples? Like, what are some key moments or figures that were influenced by Ratramnus's thinking?
Well, one of the most significant impacts was during the Reformation in the 16th century. That's when Ratramnus's book was rediscovered, and it really became a focal point in those heated debates between Protestants and Catholics about the Eucharist.
Ah, that makes total sense. The Reformation was all about challenging the traditional interpretations and seeking a more direct personal experience of faith.
Exactly. And Ratramnus's emphasis on the spiritual nature of the Eucharist, that focus on faith, it really resonated with a lot of those reformers. They saw his work as supporting their arguments against transubstantiation and that Catholic emphasis on the physical transformation of those elements.
So Ratramnus, even though he was a monk writing centuries earlier, he kind of became like an accidental Reformation hero.
You could say that. His ideas gave fuel to those who were trying to reform the church, redefine that relationship between the believer and those sacred rituals.
Wow, it's amazing how ideas can transcend time and become relevant in completely different contexts.
It really is. And it wasn't just the Protestants who were influenced by Ratramnus. Even within the Catholic Church, his work continued to generate discussion and debate. Remember we mentioned Cardinal Perron earlier?
Yeah, he was a pretty staunch critic of Ratramnus, right?
He was, but even those who disagreed with Ratramnus, they couldn't just ignore the power of his arguments. They forced theologians to really examine their own assumptions and explain the Church's stance on the Eucharist more clearly.
So, in a way, Ratramnus's challenge, even though it was controversial, it actually helped to make the church's teachings stronger, more defined.
You got it.
Yeah.
His work pushed the Church to clarify and defend those core doctrines, which ultimately led to, well, you could say, a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the Eucharist.
It's a good reminder that disagreement and debate, they can actually be really valuable for growth and understanding, even in institutions that are built on tradition and authority. A little friction can sometimes generate some light.
Absolutely. And, speaking of those who defended Ratramnus, there's John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. He's a really interesting figure in all of this.
Right. He's a strong Catholic, a big opponent of the Reformation, if I remember correctly.
That's right. But despite that, he actually found a lot to admire in Ratramnus's work. Fisher, along with some other Catholic theologians, they argued that, at the end of the day, Ratramnus was a defender of the faith, even if his way of expressing things, his approach, was a little outside the box.
So even within the Catholic Church, there were different ways of interpreting Ratramnus. Some saw him as a threat, while others saw him as an ally.
Exactly. It just goes to show that diversity of thought that existed within the Church, even on such a central doctrine like the Eucharist.
It's a good reminder that religious traditions, they're not as monolithic as we might sometimes think. There are always different perspectives, different interpretations, and it's through that back and forth, that dialogue, that debate, that a richer, more nuanced understanding can emerge.
I couldn't agree more. And this debate over Ratramnus's work, it also had a big impact on the English Reformation.
Oh, really? How so? What role did it play there?
Well, his book ended up being a key text in all those discussions about what Christ's presence in the Eucharist actually meant, what it really signified. And the interesting thing is that both sides of the debate, those who sided with the Catholic Church and those who were breaking away, they both used Ratramnus to back up their arguments.
Wow, so his ideas were being used to support very different, even opposing positions.
Exactly. I think it speaks to how rich and complex his thought was, how open to interpretation. He provided something for everyone, in a way.
It's really fascinating to see how these theological works, they can transcend their original context and speak to these timeless human questions that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And in Ratramnus's case, his work is still relevant. It still pushes us to really think about the nature of faith, the power of ritual, and those fundamental mysteries at the heart of Christianity.
Mysteries that we might never fully unravel, but that continue to draw us in, to invite us to explore.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? The journey is just as important as the destination.
Well said. It's been quite a journey exploring the life and ideas of this 9th century monk, who knew that a book about the Eucharist could spark such a long-lasting debate and have such a huge impact on Christian thought.
It just goes to show that ideas have power. And those ideas that grapple with those fundamental mysteries of faith, those are the ones that really stick with us.
And as we wrap up our deep dive, I think it's important to remember that this conversation is far from over. Ratramnus's ideas are still relevant. They're still sparking discussion and debate among theologians, historians, and anyone who's interested in exploring the deeper meaning of the Eucharist and faith itself.
He encourages us to keep asking those questions, to keep searching for those answers, to embrace that mystery.
So as you continue your own explorations, think about those questions that Ratramnus raised. How do we balance faith and reason? What role does symbolism play in our understanding of the divine? And how do we approach those mysteries that we might never fully understand?
We hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on Christian thought, on the richness of that tradition. And who knows, maybe it sparks some new questions for you to ponder.
Until next time, keep diving. There's always more to discover.